Tracey.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Arbitrator, for your attentiveness, thoughtfulness, and humor this week, and your willingness to hear and decide this matter. I don't envy you the task of spending the next several weeks culling through all the stuff that's been presented to you this past week. Lay witness testimony, expert witness testimony, compensation data, costing, punchlines, and I'm loath to mention the union CD with all that source material. I do envy you in one sense, though, because you have the opportunity to do justice, to bring compensation equity to the employees who work in the state of Washington's 12 adult prisons. You're no stranger to the world of corrections. You've issued numerous arbitration awards impacting both county and state corrections units. You presided over our 2014 interest arbitration hearing, during which you heard ample testimony about the unique challenges of working in prisons and the impact on the health, lives, and families of prison employees. As you noted in your 2014 award, corrections work is not for the faint of heart. It takes a unique person to work inside a prison. It takes a person, as you stated, who has special powers of observation and a balance between constant attention to security and interpersonal skills. You also acknowledged in your previous award that corrections work is poorly understood and substantially devalued by the public as a whole. For that reason, you built a corrections differential into your previous award, which the union urges you to continue to build upon. Mr. Arbitrator, you have the opportunity to do justice and bring equity to the Teamsters 117 represented DOC employees, but the union recognizes that your authority is constrained by the MOU between the parties. You provided the parties a roadmap for following that MOU in your last award. The union has arduously attempted to follow that roadmap in this proceeding. As I guide you down the path toward justice and equity, I'd like to first address philosophy. It appears that both parties learned something from your prior award, so there likely isn't going to be anything in either party's evidence that you would find majestically misleading. That is not to say, however, that there aren't significant and meaningful discrepancies, particularly in the compensation evidence. The most significant and meaningful of those discrepancies is the methodology employed by the employer in its comparable analysis. Rather than analyzing the value received by the employee of compensation and benefits, the employer evaluated comparables using cost to the employer of compensation and benefits. You should reject the employer's methodology, both because the MOU compels it, but also because the methodology employed by the union is the most reasonable way to evaluate compensation in the collective bargaining process context. RCW 4180-020 prohibits state unions from bargaining over pension rates or benefits. If we can't bargain over them and the employer dictates them, then the employee should not be penalized based on the costs of those benefits to the employer. So we have a philosophical difference between the state and the union regarding the methodology for evaluating comparables. But as I said, the MOU compels the approach that the union employed. In fact, we believe that you resolved this question in your previous award when you stated that the MOU unambiguously calls for a benefits survey. Thus, the union's compensation methodology should be adopted. The union's compensation proposal, its protected position, includes bringing the bargaining unit halfway to the weighted average of the comparables in year 1, plus a 3.5% COLA, bringing the unit the rest of the way to the weighted average of the comparables in year 2, plus a 3.5% COLA. It also provides for specific range adjustments for a number of medical and mental health positions that are experiencing extreme recruitment and retention problems, correcting the Sergeant and CC3 spread, premium adjustments, including adding SISM to the specialty teams, paying the specialty team premium for all hours, paying a premium for BFOQ positions, a BFOQ transfer bonus, double time for OT and a BFOQ position, double time for voluntary OT, $15 an hour for all instructors of staff, and premiums to make employees eligible for callback. Increased base shift premium, increased nurse shift premium, include CNAs and MAs in the nurse shift premium. Increased call pay, Reimburse employees up to $200 for licenses and renewals. And finally, convert Step M and U to a standard step increase. The union believes that it has presented strong evidence in support of its proposals. Which brings me to your roadmap on the MOU. The parties' interest arbitration MOU at Joint Exhibit 5 is identical to the MOU that you were bound by 2 years ago. The factors to be considered have not changed. The first enumerated factor, but not the paramount factor, just one of several, is the financial ability of the Department of Corrections to pay for the compensation and benefits awarded. You were faced with a challenging task in the last arbitration, with clear evidence that most, if not all, of the classifications surveyed were behind market, as is the case today, but also with strong evidence that the state was in a less than healthy financial position. You had to try to find the sweet spot, where you awarded enough to at least to begin to crack the nut of undercompensation, but not too much such that the award wouldn't be deemed financially feasible by OFM. Your job should be easier this go-around, as it is undisputed that the state's economic condition is significantly improved from 2 years ago. Governor Inslee, in his 2016 State of the State address, celebrated that Washington continues to rank in the top 5 states for job growth. In fact, according to the Economic and Revenue Forecast Council, Washington employment growth in 2015 was 2.8%, which was the highest since 2006. Washington has the fastest domestic product growth in the nation. Washington exports grew a whopping 20% over the past few years, and since 2013, Washington has added nearly 250,000 jobs. Further, as demonstrated by the union, Washington's economic health is undeniable. Its general fund ending balance in 2015 was close to $3 billion, greater than it's been for over a decade, even accounting for the Budget Destabilization Fund. The share of revenue going to pay debt has declined, and the state's credit rating is strong. Further, as shown in Union Exhibit 45, the most recent economic revenue forecast from June projects baseline revenues to be nearly $300 million higher than the previous forecast for the 2015-17 biennium, and $126 million higher for the 17-19 biennium, and $134 million higher for the 19-21 biennium. The state does not and cannot deny that Washington's economy is healthy by any measure. Personal income continues to rise, employment continues to rise, and the cost and number of housing units continues to rise. This results in rising revenues. The state's own budget witness, a senior budget assistant from OFM, testified that the June forecast was definitely good news. As in the previous interest arbitration, the DOC points to the McCleary decision as its trump card for inability to pay its employees equitably. The union does not deny the state's obligations with respect to funding education. But according to Mr. Pancock, the state's witness, the legislature has already provided $2.3 billion in phase-in dollars for McCleary. Further, the union presented evidence that the value of both the employer and union proposals in this case is such a small fraction of the potential cost to fund McCleary as to be a drop in the bucket. Awarding Teamsters represented DOC employees equitable compensation is not going to impact the state's ability or inability to comply with the McCleary decision. Finally, the union presented evidence of the many highly capitalized, successful companies in the state: Amazon, Boeing, Starbucks, Microsoft, Costco, all a potential source of revenue generation. Given Washington's healthy economy, which continues to trend upward, the evidence establishes that the state's ability to pay for the union's proposed compensation currently exists and will continue to. The second factor of the MOU, the constitutional and statutory authority of the employer, is not at issue. The third factor considers the stipulation of the parties. In this regard, the parties followed the arbitrator's roadmap set forth in your prior decision. So unlike in the previous proceeding where the parties did not agree upon the states to be surveyed or benchmark positions, here the parties agreed upon both. The parties stipulated that 5 states should be surveyed for comparables: Colorado, Utah, Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona. Similarly, the union identified and proposed to the department 17 benchmark benchmark positions, which account for 90% of the bargaining unit, including the most populated positions of CO2 and CO3, and the employer agreed to those benchmarks. Consequently, the arbitrator's task is made somewhat easier by the stipulation of the parties in these areas. During the course of proceedings, the parties also stipulated to the $12 minimum wage range adjustments and that existing assignment pay would be embedded in the salary range. So those matters have been dealt with. The fourth and sixth factors under the MOU require the arbitrator to consider comparison of wages, hours, and working conditions of DOC employees with the wages, hours, and conditions of employment of like personnel in like state government of similar size in the Western U.S. and the overall compensation presently received by DOC employees. Again, the parties stipulated to the 5 Western states that would be surveyed for the purposes of this arbitration. The union retained Carla Pusateri to perform a total compensation study surveying those 5 states against the 17 benchmark positions. Ms. Pusateri has been performing compensation analyses for 13 years, and she was also our expert witness at the interest arbitration in 2014. As stated earlier, the methodology used by Ms. Pusateri, consistent with the parties' MOU, was to value the total compensation including leaves received by the employees. Ms. Pusateri evaluated at the entry-level, 10-year, and 25-year for each benchmark classification. Her results, summarized in Union Exhibit 8, demonstrate that at the max 25-year mark, every benchmark classification except one needed wage adjustments from a low of 3.52% to a high of 38.12% to meet the average of the comparables. Even using the state's own flawed compensation analysis, CO2s, the largest single classification, are 85% behind the average of market comparables, requiring a 17.5% increase to meet the average of the comparables. Paul Marvey, the union's research director, calculated the unit-wide adjustment needed to reach parity based on a weighted average of compensation to comparables. Applying the 4.3% increase received by DOC Teamsters July 1 and the 1.755% average increase the comparables received, the unit-wide adjustment based on the employer data would need to be 17.9% to reach parity. There really is no dispute that the compensation data evidences that DOC Teamsters are substantially behind the market average in almost every benchmark classification. The next factor to be considered under the parties' MOU is the ability of the department to recruit or retain employees. Steve Sinclair testified that there is a recruitment problem for COs, though he thinks he could probably relieve it by reducing the qualifications needed to apply for custody positions. Eric Hernandez testified that there is definitely a recruitment and retention problem for medical and mental health professionals that can only be addressed by increasing compensation for those staff. The state's own proposals for targeted increases for medical, dental, and mental health staff evidence the recruitment and retention problems in health services. Despite Mr. Sinclair's claim that recruitment wasn't really a problem on the custody side, in the 2015 DOC Prison Overtime Usage Report submitted to the legislature at Union Exhibit 26, the department admits that custody positions statewide are hard to fill. Indeed, and I quote, "The DOC competes with counties, cities, other states, and federal and tribal governments who typically pay higher wages. It is common to lose custody staff to law enforcement and other corrections facilities after DOC has invested in training these staff," end quote. As Paul Marvey testified and is shown in Unit Exhibit 23, there are several indicators of recruitment and retention problems, including turnover, overtime, the time it takes to fill vacancies, use of contractors, and hiring staff above the first step. All of these indicators exist for DOC across classifications. There's no dispute among the parties that there is a recruitment and a retention issue with respect to several healthcare and mental health classifications. Both the employer and the union have proposed targeted range increases for those particular classifications. The targeted range increase adjustments to the Teamsters salary schedule as proposed by the union are more justified, as are the across-the-board wage increases, which should apply to these classifications who also receive the targeted increases. With respect to the next consideration, changes in factors listed during the pendency of the proceedings, this would include the 4.3 wage increase received by the Teamsters Unit July 1, 2016, and the 1.75 average wage increase received by the comparable jurisdictions since the January 1, 2016 snapshot. The union factored these changes into their documents reflecting weighted average of the max-to-max comparables at Union Exhibit 51. The final consideration for the arbitrator under the parties' MOU is any other factor normally or traditionally taken into consideration. It is under this factor that the union asserts that the arbitrator should consider county comparables, internal inequity, and wage erosion. With respect to the county comparables, DOC acknowledged in the testimony of Steve Sinclair and Eric Hernandez, and in the 2015 report to the legislature on overtime, that it has a recruitment and retention problem because of counties and other local competitors paying higher compensation. In the previous interest arbitration, the union presented county comparable data, which the arbitrator rejected, not because the data was irrelevant, but because the union could not justify how it had chosen the particular counties. In this proceeding, Paul Marvey testified that he analyzed where the majority of our members live and work, and identified 10 counties: Benton, Clallam, Franklin, Grays Harbor, Mason, Pierce, Snohomish, Spokane, Thurston, and Walla Walla. As Union Exhibit 50 shows, 86% of the employees in the surveyed classification live in those 10 counties, and 77.5% of the total bargaining unit lives in these counties. As further evidence that county data should be considered by the arbitrator, the state itself relies on such data when it conducts its general salary survey at Union Exhibit 11. Again, this is because the real competitor is not another state, but another public or private entity in the area where the employee lives. Ms. Pusateri conducted a compensation analysis using the counties identified by Mr. Marvey and applying the same methodology as in her state comp study. The summary of the county data, Union Exhibit 20, is truly astounding. Because county corrections do not provide the same level of services that state corrections does, the two benchmark classifications for which there was a match for all surveyed counties were CO2 and CO3. CO2 total compensation at the 10-year point was 37.44% off the county market average, and the CO3 total compensation was 42.22% off the county market average. The union believes that the evidence supports equal consideration of county data. It directly bears on recruitment and retention, is relied upon by the state in its general salary survey, and it gives a more realistic depiction of where these employees stand in relation to true comparables. Now, internal inequity. This is what I am referring to when I'm thinking about BFOQ. I think both parties and the arbitrator agree that there is a serious inequity occurring in the women's prisons. As Charlotte Wyman testified, female officers are experiencing a total undermining of their seniority rights as they're pulled from bid positions to cover a BFOQ female-only position, or mandated to work OT in a BFOQ position when a less senior male employee is not. The amount of forced overtime is wreaking havoc on these female employees' lives. When forced to hold over, their child care arrangements become harrowing, they're not getting enough sleep, they're not getting time with their families. The union has proposed a 5% premium for BFOQ female-only positions at the women's prisons. It's also proposed a transfer bonus of $5,000 plus moving expenses for anyone who moves into a BFOQ position, and double time for all overtime worked in a BFOQ position. We understand that the arbitrator might be reluctant to try to address this problem simply by allocating money through premiums and incentives, but in truth, there is no other way to address it. What we need is a change in the staffing model. However, RCW 4180-040 precludes us from asking for that change. So the only way to get to the necessary change is to induce the state and the department to it by increasing the cost of having a deficient staffing model for those positions where they exclude half or more than half of the population. And this is only fair because it is internalizing the costs that the women are suffering simply because they are women. Longer hours, away from family by mandate, greater fatigue, and therefore risk. Now, you could fashion an award that eliminated premiums or overtime incentives when and if the staffing models are fixed. So you do have room, I believe, to address this issue until the staffing model is addressed. The union knows that it's an imperfect solution, but it's all we have, so please do not leave the problem unaddressed just because the only available solution is imperfect. Wage erosion. During my time with the union, I frequently heard DOC employees complain that they did not have enough the spending power that they once had, even though they received wage increases. As Paul Marvey demonstrated and exhibited in Union 33, our DOC members were completely right. Factoring in the effect of location pay, inflation, pension rate increases, and medical premium increases, CO2 wages have eroded 10.2% from 2007. CC2 wages were similarly eroded by 10.6%. This even after the 4.3% July 1 wage increase was considered. Mr. Arbitrator, this erosion must be given significant weight. Even with wage increases from your previous award, our members do not have the spending power that they had 10 years ago. We urge you to address the reality of this wage erosion as you determine your award. Finally, the union believes that it has established a basis for each of its other proposals. The union has proposed that double time be paid on all voluntary overtime hours worked. The reason for this, as explained by Ms. Woodrow, is to incent employees to volunteer for overtime so that fewer employees are mandatoried for overtime. Excessive mandatory overtime is not only a staff morale issue, it is a retention issue. In the category of premium pay, the exclusion of critical incident stress management, CISM, team members from the specialty team pay makes no sense. CISM is a vital resource and provides essential support for employees when there has been a critical incident at a facility. They deserve the specialty pay, and all specialty team members should receive that premium for all hours worked. They're specially trained and required to respond at a moment's notice. The basic shift premium is too low at 65 cents per hour. Even the department acknowledges this, as it has proposed an increase to $1 an hour. The union submits that $1.50 is more appropriate given how night shift work negatively affects an employee's health. The nurse shift premium is embarrassingly low. The union presented evidence in Exhibits 29, 30, and 31 that Oregon correctional nurses and nurses in Washington and other bargaining units receive a graveyard shift premium of $2.25 an hour in the case of Oregon and $4 and $4.25 an hour in other Washington bargaining units. Swing shift premium is $1.85 for Oregon correctional nurses and $2.50 for nurses in other Washington bargaining units. The union's proposal to increase the nurse shift premium to $2.50 is abundantly reasonable. Further, the lowest paid medical staff, the CNAs and the MAs, should not be deprived of shift premium. Article 32.17 should be revised to include these employees. Callback pay is likewise too low. For an employee to put her life on hold for $50 a day is ridiculous. The union's proposed increase from 50 to 100 and 25 to 50 is reasonable. The union's proposal to convert steps M and U is an additional way to address retention concerns. If I had to wait 6 years at step L or T before seeing a step increase, I'd be looking for a new job. We know from the union's evidence that the department is hiring people above the first step, sometimes even at step L. What incentive is there for that employee to stay on if they won't see another step increase for 6 years? There is a significant compression in the classification counselor series. As you heard from James Rollins, currently the CC3 is only 2 ranges above the CC2, who they supervise. The CC series should at least align with the CO series. The union has proposed a 5-range adjustment for CC3 and a 2-range adjustment for CO3, which would result in a meaningful 7-range spread between the supervisor and her supervisees. In the category of pay for work performed, the union has two proposals. The first involves instructor pay in reference 42. Instructor pay should be increased from $10 to $15 per hour and should be given to anyone who instructs staff, not limited to firearms, defensive tactics, and fitness. If you're instructing staff, and it shouldn't matter the nature of the instruction. Similarly, there is a need to appropriately compensate shift commanders at standalone minimums. As Richard Mate testified, although his classification is sergeant, he is assigned as shift commander. He's responsible for the security of everyone in the prison, to ensure adequate staffing, manage all movement. He's an incident commander. He places offenders in segregation when there has been a serious incident. His compensation should reflect the level of responsibility he bears. Finally, the union proposes that the state reimburse up to $200 for certification or renewal that are not necessarily compelled by the employer. The reason is that it benefits the employer to have the most skilled workforce, and it should encourage that. The state's compensation proposal does little for the vast majority of the bargaining unit. The unit's wage erosion is going to continue. 3% in each year of the agreement won't put a dent in that, let alone address the gross undercompensation relative to the average comparables. Mr. Arbitrator, it is so disheartening to know how hard these correctional employees work, how proud they are to be public safety professionals, how difficult it is to work inside the walls of a prison, and to see how undervalued and undercompensated they are. After you consider all the evidence, all the required factors under the parties' MOU, the union is confident that you will reach an award that significantly, if not completely, closes the gap by applying the weighted average across the bargaining unit and bring our members up to the average of their comparables. Thank you.
Thanks.